without a doubt, the biggest, squishiest 3-pound mystery in all of science. The human brain.
It really is.
We're diving into the architecture of self, and honestly, it gets a little existential.
It does, because it's the ultimate control center yet. It operates largely in the shadows. I mean, it's responsible for everything. Your deepest feelings, your personality quirks, every moment of awareness, and ultimately, the feeling of who you are.
And here's the core dilemma we're unpacking today for you, the listener. Every single one of us walks around with this powerful, persistent feeling that we are a single, unified person.
Right, the main character.
Exactly, the agent of our story, fully and deliberately in control. But when you look inside, your brain is made up of almost 90 billion neurons firing away in complex networks. And the vast majority of that activity is completely outside of your conscious awareness.
And that's the key. What the science reveals is that this deeply ingrained feeling of a single unified self inside the skull is actually a very convincing and, more importantly, a necessary illusion.
A necessary illusion.
Yeah. It's a coherent narrative that the brain constructs from countless simultaneous, mostly unconscious processes. The goal of this deep dive is to, investigate that construct.
So our mission today is to dive deep into sources from neurology, psychology, and even genetics that pull back the curtain on this illusion. We're looking at what researchers like Yuri Miles call that very large fraction of what's happening in my brain I am not aware of at all. We're asking, how fragile is our sense of agency? And if the conscious I is just the spokesperson, what part of your brain is really driving the vehicle of your life?
And this is such an essential intellectual exercise because, the idea that we are in full, deliberate, and unified control of our actions, it's absolutely critical to our sense of personal identity.
It's everything.
It underpins our entire framework for morality, for societal structure, responsibility, law. Without that feeling, the system feels like it collapses.
Exactly. You feel like, if I want to stand up right now, I can. If I want to choose the word representation from a book, I will. That feeling of immediate volition, social psychologists like Mazar Banaji say, it gives us this often false belief that everything we do has been chosen deliberately by us, the conscious agent.
But the reality is that you are only aware of the final, polished output of the system. You have no direct awareness of the vast, intricate network running everything, from regulating your core temperature and heart rate to the sophisticated processes involved in memory representation, sensory integration.
The complex mechanics of language processing.
All of it. These processes are happening constantly below the surface, like the sophisticated, flawless clockwork of an engine you never see.
And that's fine most of the time. Most of the time, the brain is this coordinated, well-oiled machine with all its different regions working together in harmony. But what we are looking for today are the glitches. Because when things are out of sync, when that coordination fails, or the connections are severed, that's when we gain the deepest, most unsettling insight into how the whole system is actually put together. Okay, so let's unpack this with our first major area of evidence. If we truly are a unified conscious self, capable of unified action, what happens when parts of that self or parts of the machine disconnect?
This is where it gets really interesting.
We're exploring these dramatic phenomena that reveal consciousness is definitely not an all or none switch, but more like a spectrum of function.
Exactly. This is where we start to see how that intricate 3-pound piece of matter functions when its usual systems of self-monitoring and communication break down. It proves the existence of sophisticated operations happening completely independent of our awareness.
And the first profound glitch we have to look at is sleepwalking.
Yes.
Emmanuel During, who has studied these fascinating cases, calls sleepwalking a profound glitch in the system, precisely because the person's core identity, the conscious I, is not involved.
Right. The patients often wake up bewildered and say, I didn't do that. That's not me. They are deeply estranged from their own actions.
And to really appreciate the depth of this, we need to pause and recognize just how complex the physical behavior of walking is. We take bipedal movement completely for granted.
Totally.
But think about the sheer computational power and constant delicate balance required just to teach a robot to perform bipedal movement. It requires constant recalibration of balance, micro-adjustments for surface changes.
The coordination of hundreds of muscle groups.
All of that works flawlessly in sleepwalkers, completely independent of conscious thought.
Right. It's procedural memory and motor control running on full auto. And what the sleep lab findings at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai revealed is truly remarkable regarding why this happens.
It's all in the brainwaves.
Yeah. So when a patient is in deep, restorative, slow-wave sleep, the brain waves are, as you'd expect, slow, rhythmic, and, highly monotonous. But during a sleepwalking event, there's a sudden split arousal phenomenon. It's fascinating. Part of the brain suddenly shifts and looks awake. The eyes open, visual centers are active. You see fast arousal patterns indicating wakefulness.
Huh.
But a couple of key regions stay completely locked in that deep, slow-wave sleep state. It's like turning on the power to a house, but leaving the circuit breaker for one specific room switched off.
And the key region that consistently stays locked in deep sleep is the prefrontal cortex, the PFC.
Which is absolutely critical.
Why is that so important?
Well, because the PFC isn't just about choice. It is the seat of high-level executive function. This includes deliberate, goal-oriented planning, impulse control, delayed gratification.
Regulating complex social cognition and, most importantly, self-awareness.
Exactly. It is the chief executive officer, the decision maker, and the filter.
So when the CEO checks out, the implication is massive.
It is. The other areas of the brain, the motor cortex for movement planning, the visual cortex processing external visual information, and the parts coordinating balance, spatial navigation, even rudimentary speech, they can all become fully active and operational.
Which means the body can execute these extraordinarily complex, highly goal-oriented behaviors that you would think require full, focused consciousness.
Yeah, we've heard these incredible anecdotes of sleepwalkers doing things like navigating complex staircases, preparing and eating full meals, sending text messages.
I remember reading about one famous case. A patient walked out of their house and painted a geometrically perfect triangle on their kitchen wall.
A perfect track.
All executed flawlessly without conscious awareness because the filter was asleep.
Susana Martinez Conde, who studies consciousness and perception, she notes that experiences like sleepwalking unequivocally reveal that being conscious is not an all-or-none situation.
There it is again.
The survival systems of the brain motor control, spatial awareness, they're designed to function, and they do so complexly even when the main identity system, the self-aware PFC, is offline. This fragmentation is fundamental to understanding our operating system.
That distinction, the difference between being functionally awake and consciously aware, that is a huge learning moment.
It is.
So moving beyond sleep, which is a natural cyclical loss of consciousness, let's look at general anesthesia. This removes conscious experience in a much more profound, controlled, and thankfully reversible way.
Anesthesia provides a crucial, controllable experiment in consciousness. When anesthesiologists like Dr. Emery Brown use an EEG, those electrodes on the scalp detecting electrical activity, they can literally watch brain activity collapse in real time as a patient goes under.
And what does that look like? When you're awake and fully aware, the EEG shows rich, dynamic, diverse activity, right? Across many different frequencies and amplitudes.
Yeah, it looks like an exciting conversation happening across various regions, all simultaneously firing and interacting. But when that precise cocktail of anesthesia drugs hits the brain, they don't just shut the brain off, they fundamentally alter the communication patterns.
So it's not an off switch, it's more like a signal jammer.
That's a great way to put it. The difference is striking and immediate. That rich, diverse conversation collapses into what is described as dull, slow-rolling brainwaves, an unintelligible hum. The core mechanism of the drugs isn't shutting down the neurons themselves, but preventing the high-frequency oscillation and integration required for complex thought.
And if you alter that communication sufficiently, specifically the ability for these different regions to share complex information.
Dream juice on consciousness.
And the star player in this critical communication network is a structure called the thalamus.
Yes. It's this deep, central, paired structure in the brain, often described as two walnut-sized hubs. The thalamus acts as the essential way station, but more specifically, it is the sensory gating mechanism. It routes all types of incoming information, auditory, visual, pain signals up to the cortex, and determines which information gets priority.
So it's not just a post office for information, it's the air traffic controller, deciding what signals need to be integrated into our current conscious reality.
Precisely. And if you sufficiently disrupt the communication through the thalamus, the complex, integrated conversational activity across the cortex just ceases.
So consciousness isn't about one specific location being on.
No, it's about the integration of information flow, the ability of various pieces of hardware to talk to each other rapidly and richly.
And the moment the patient begins to wake up from surgery, the EEG shows the brainwave activity becoming more complex again.
Right, representing that active cognitive processing and integration that allows us to think and act consciously. It highlights that connectivity, not necessarily the specific piece of hardware, is what generates the conscious experience.
Which leads us perfectly to perhaps the most startling and, the most concrete evidence of a non-unitary self, split brain surgery.
This is truly the most mind-bending finding in neuroscience. It literally creates the scenario Michael Gazzaniga described as two separated minds inside one system. It's fragmentation made physical.
Okay, so for listeners who may not be familiar, this procedure was a drastic but often effective treatment for people with severe debilitating epilepsy.
Right. When a seizure starts in one hemisphere of the brain, it can spread rapidly and violently to the other via the corpus callosum.
And that's this massive bundle of nerve fibers, right?
A massive bundle containing hundreds of millions of fiber connections. It's the superhighway between the two halves of the brain.
And by surgically severing that connection, cutting the bridge between the two halves, the seizures can't cross. The person looks and acts completely normal in daily life, but the side effect.
The side effect is that the two hemispheres, while still connected to the body, become mentally separated. And this reveals their unique, independent specializations.
And those specializations are so key to understanding the results. The left hemisphere is the dominant verbal one.
It contains the primary speech centers, it talks, it reasons verbally, it rationalizes, it's the storyteller.
And the right hemisphere is largely nonverbal, but it's crucial for visual space evaluation, understanding emotions, handling complex spatial tasks.
And a key part of the demonstration relies on how visual information is wired. This is so cool. Because of how the optic nerves cross, everything in your left visual field goes only to the nonverbal right hemisphere.
And everything in the right visual field goes exclusively to the verbal left hemisphere.
And they cannot share that information unless the corpus callosum is intact.
The famous fighting hands demonstration illustrates this lack of integration beautifully. We can all relate to the interference. If I ask you, the listener, to try right now to draw two completely different geometric shapes simultaneously, say a triangle with your right hand and a circle with your left, you just can't do it.
You can't. The commands cross and interfere with each other. The motor commands from the left hemisphere trying to control the right hand interfere with the motor commands from the right hemisphere controlling the left hand because the corpus callosum is constantly synchronizing and correcting those signals.
But in split brain patients,
there is zero interference.
it's amazing.
They can draw the triangle perfectly with one hand and the circle with the other simultaneously. It's almost as if you have one mind controlling the left hand and a completely different mind controlling the right hand, acting independently on distinct plans.
But the visual field experiment is even more telling regarding the loss of conscious identity.
This is the really wild part. In one test, Gazzaniga would flash an image for a millisecond to the left visual field, so it went to the nonverbal right brain, and an image of a completely different object to the right visual field, which went to the verbal left brain.
So when the patient was asked, "What did you see?"
Their talking left hemisphere would only report the object seen in the right visual field. The information about the object seen by the right hemisphere simply couldn't cross the severed corpus callosum to inform the verbal reporting center. It had no idea.
But when they were asked to point to what they saw with their left hand, which is controlled by the nonverbal right hemisphere,
they would point to the object seen by the right hemisphere. The right brain knows it saw the object, understood the concept, and acted on it, but the verbal part of the brain that defines I and communicates has no idea that interaction ever occurred.
that is genuinely unsettling. It means that a thinking, acting entity is operating outside the purview of the identity that can speak and form memories.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the iconic anecdote of the patient named Joe.
Yes, Joe.
This proves that the separated hemisphere doesn't just register the information. It processes, conceptualizes, and remembers it all on its own.
Right. So in the classic setup, the researchers flashed the word Texas to Joe's left visual field, sending the information exclusively to his nonverbal right hemisphere.
So when Joe's verbal left hemisphere was asked what he saw,
he claimed to have seen nothing, or maybe just a flash of light.
but here's the genius of the follow-up test. They asked him to draw what he saw using his left hand, which is controlled by the right hemisphere that did see the word.
And Joe, completely unaware of why he was drawing it, would sketch the word Texas, or, in another trial, spontaneously draw a cowboy hat, a complex, symbolic representation of Texas.
Wow.
The right hemisphere was able to see the word, understand its symbolic significance, access a memory associated with it, and initiate a complex motor action, all without the knowledge of the conscious, speaking left hemisphere.
Gazzaniga noted that the cooperation was literally on the paper, not inside the head.
Exactly. The talking left side was still confused and unaware, but the right side demonstrated a clear, separate mental entity operating within the same skull.
The takeaway here, according to neuroscientists like Nancy Canwisher, is so profound. Our intuitive sense that we are a unitary, singular being. It just belies the fact that our mind is actually composed of lots of specialized independent pieces doing distinct things.
The I is not a single centralized thing. It is a distributed, ongoing fiction constructed by a complex machine.
That sets the stage beautifully.
Yeah.
So we've established that the brain is this fragmented, specialized system capable of operating complexly even when the conscious I is offline or severed.
Right.
So now we have to ask, if the self is fragmented, what is the architecture that creates that feeling of being in charge? And how easily can that feeling, that sense of agency, be disrupted?
This is where we look at the brain as fundamentally the meaning maker machine. I love this concept. The brain evolved not necessarily to discover objective truth, but to keep us alive.
Survival.
And to do that, it cannot tolerate blanks. It is constantly filling in sensory gaps and creating a narrative of cause and effect, weaving a coherent story where one might not actually exist.
And that coherence has to include the feeling of agency. Kasturi suggests we might have that feeling of consciousness precisely because it supports agency. It allows us to pretend like we are the ones making decisions.
And therefore taking ownership of the rewards or the failures.
Yeah.
It's the brain filling in the blanks to make sure the story of me makes sense.
Mazrin Banaji emphasizes that we simply cannot operate in the world without believing we understand what is happening and why we are doing it. That filling in of the blanks is vital to give meaning and make sense of the constant, overwhelming stream of events.
Absolutely. If we acknowledge the full fragmentation all the time, decision-making would just grind to a halt.
So to illustrate how easily that feeling of agency can be manipulated, neuroscientist Uri Maus ran a few fascinating trials that felt less like science and more like parlor tricks.
The magic tricks.
The magic tricks. I can recall the feeling. You sit down for the first time, and he presents this sealed envelope.
And then, completely out of the blue, he asks you to choose a seat or to perform some seemingly arbitrary action. You believe you've made a choice based on pure free will.
And he opens the envelope and predicts exactly where you sat. Or you're asked to leaf through a book and pick a random word. You choose representation. And the card in the original envelope you received predicts that exact word.
The feeling is instant and deeply unsettling.
It is. You know, logically, they are utilizing sleights of hand, probability, and misdirection, but immediately you start to question your own volition. Wait a minute, was that really me? Am I that predictable? It makes you wonder how you truly distinguish a deliberate choice from a carefully guided one.
The magic trick reveals how readily we question our choices when the expected, continuous outcome is disrupted. The brain is looking for a reason for why something happened, and if the narrative of personal choice is undermined by an external prediction, the sense of agency starts to dissolve.
So to understand how that internal sense of control is synthesized, we need to look closer at the anatomy of integrated decision-making, particularly the crucial role of emotion.
And the definitive starting point for understanding how emotional regulation is intertwined with the self is the famous 19th century case of Phineas Gage.
An incredible story. Gage suffered a catastrophic accident where an iron tamping rod passed straight through his skull, destroying much of his left and right prefrontal cortex.
It was medically astounding. He survived. Gage retained his memory, his language skills, and his motor control. He could still walk, talk, and perform basic intellectual tasks.
For a long time, researchers thought the brain was purely modular. If the language center was fine, language was fine.
But the functional loss was profound. His personality, everything that made him him, completely fractured. He became fitful, irreverent, profane, and unreliable.
He lost his social filter.
He lost his ability to plan for the future, his capacity for appropriate moral behavior. This event proved unequivocally that your personality, your morality, and your ability to interact appropriately in a complex social environment are housed in that same physical structure, the PFC.
His functional loss was the ability to integrate emotional information and regulate his behavior based on consequences, which led to his disastrous social struggles.
Exactly. And this understanding of emotion guiding behavior is explored through modern studies, like Luke Chang's work using the trust game.
This is a fascinating setup. Here, participants have to make these rapid investment decisions, balancing the immediate, powerful dopamine reward of acting selfishly, keeping all the money, versus the heavy, long-term feeling of guilt associated with being uncooperative.
And the brain scans during this game revealed a sophisticated emotional anatomy at work, showing how certain regions monitor and regulate social behavior. They identified the insula as acting like the brain's thermometer or early warning system.
A thermometer.
Yeah, it detects the ambient emotional temperature of a scenario, specifically signaling a visceral gut feeling that an action might be a bad idea. It warns us of the social or emotional cost of harming or betraying someone else.
So that's the instantaneous, almost bodily feeling you get when you're tempted to cheat or keep all the money. That internal thermometer immediately tells you this is going to violate my social contract and feel bad later.
Exactly. But that raw emotional information needs to be processed and integrated into a deliberate action plan. And that's the role of the brain's thermostat, a regulatory region located inside the prefrontal cortex.
Okay, so a thermometer and a thermostat.
The thermostat integrates the emotional data from the insula and helps regulate behavior. It pushes us toward better, more cooperative decisions, essentially prioritizing social cohesion over immediate personal gain.
So the fascinating conclusion here is that emotions aren't just irrational obstacles leading to poor decisions, as older psychological models sometimes suggested.
Not at all.
If your goal is to be cooperative and maintain social standing, emotions are actively helping us make better long-term decisions by providing that vital contextual information, often before our conscious mind fully processes the ethical dilemma.
They are deep evolutionary mechanisms that guide behavior, developed to ensure our survival as a social species, often operating outside our immediate, deliberate, conscious thought. Which leads us perfectly to the most direct test of agency, experimentally disrupting the sense of control itself using physics.
This is where neuroscientists use transcranial magnetic stimulation, or TMS, to test exactly how fragile our feeling of control truly is.
It's an incredible tool.
So Tomas, the volunteer, is fitted with the device, and the researchers can stimulate his motor cortex to involuntarily make his finger jump, like a miniature invisible marionette string.
And the technology gives them a crucial head start. Researchers are monitoring the electrical signals that travel from the brain's motor cortex down to the muscles. They can detect the small electrical command that initiates movement almost 50 milliseconds before the participant's muscle actually twitches.
So they can effectively predict the action slightly before it occurs.
Because the decision has already left the conscious sphere and is in the execution phase.
Now, they put this sense of control to the ultimate test. In some trials, Tomas decides to move his finger on his own, believing he is the agent of the action. But just as he initiates that movement,
the magnetic field is used to deliver a precise external stimulus, slightly accelerating or changing the trajectory of his finger jump. This external intervention deliberately confuses the internal feedback loop.
So even though Tomas was the one who initiated the movement, when the TMS intervenes, he almost universally disclaimed agency.
He did. He would say things like, "That wasn't me, I didn't initiate the movement," or "The computer did that." He actively relinquished control.
This is a profoundly important demonstration, and it requires us to reconsider what agency even is. What this suggests is that the sense of agency is fundamentally retrospective.
Yes. It is not a forward-looking decision maker, as we assume. Instead, the brain is essentially looking back at what the body did, and it checks if the feedback, the sensory inputs, the resulting visual confirmation, the expected internal signals, which is called the efference copy, if all of that aligns perfectly with the movement that actually happened.
And if that complex alignment holds up.
You get that feeling of being the author of the action, the unified I. But if the magnetic intervention messes up that alignment, if the efferent copy doesn't match the actual sensory return, the brain misinterprets the action and assigns control to an external force.
Our feeling of voluntary action is thus largely a narrative constructed after the fact to explain the body's movements.
It's slightly alarming to realize that the brain is, as they say, quite happy to relinquish control if the feedback doesn't match the internal expectation. It prioritizes the coherence of the narrative over the reality of who initiated the motion.
So far, we've seen the self split by surgery and sleep, and we've seen agency manipulated and shown to be retrospective in the lab. But the influences on who you are, They don't stop at the skull, and they don't even stop at your own lifetime.
No, they don't.
The brain is profoundly social, and it is constantly being molded by external pressures, including our ancestors.
Our brain simply doesn't operate in a vacuum. We have evolved to be the most hypersocial species on the planet, and a massive amount of our computational power and brain architecture is devoted to effortlessly reasoning about other people.
What they know, what they feel, what they expect of us.
All of it. This constant monitoring is computationally demanding. How we act, who we are, even what decisions we prioritize are hugely determined by the expectations of the people around us.
We are constantly running simulations of social interactions in our heads. We are learning, taking cues, comparing our performance, and synchronizing our internal, emotional, and cognitive models with other brains in our proximity.
And that constant interaction means your brain is never static. It is constantly rewiring itself. Every experience, every moment of synchronization, every sentence you hear, every new social setting you navigate, changes your brain in minute detail through a process called plasticity.
So the old saying holds profound neurological truth.
Hmm.
We are, in fact, the company that we keep.
Your neurological patterns are literally being remolded by your social and cultural environment.
But the influence goes back much further than who you hung out with last week or even what culture you grew up in. Certain environmental experiences can be so profound, so extreme, that they impact our brain biology across generations.
And this brings us to the science of epigenetics.
Right.
Epigenetics studies how the environment and individual experiences can change the way genes are expressed or activated in the body and brain without changing the underlying DNA sequence itself.
It fundamentally challenges the older deterministic idea that your genes are simply set in stone at birth.
Exactly. They're constantly being tagged and modified based on environmental inputs, signals like stress, famine, or safety.
The classic, highly specific example illustrating this transgenerational trauma is the Dickel famine at the end of World War II.
A terrible but scientifically powerful example. During the winter of 1944-45, Nazi troops cut off food supplies to the Netherlands, leading to mass starvation and profound widespread trauma across the population.
And what researchers observed decades later was shocking and required highly specific gene tracking. Not only did the people who suffered during the famine experience immediate health problems, but their children, and even their grandchildren, later exhibited altered health profiles.
Including higher rates of metabolic issues, obesity, and heart disease.
And the key was identifying the physical mechanism. They found specific methylation patterns. These are chemical tags placed on the DNA that control whether a gene is turned on or off on key genes, like IGF-2, the insulin-like growth factor 2 gene.
Right. The famine changed the methylation pattern on the IGF-2 gene in the surviving children, and those patterns were somehow maintained and passed down to the next generation. This raised the critical question: how can a traumatic experience suffered by a parent change the biological wiring of the offspring?
This is exactly what neuroscientist Bianca Jones-Marlin sought to pin down using a highly controlled mouse model. She asked how an environmentally conditioned fear could alter the biology of the offspring in such a specific way.
And the experiment was it was elegantly designed. It involved conditioning male mice by pairing a potent, specific environmental cue, the smell of almond or cetaphenone, with an electric shock.
And mice rely heavily on their sense of smell for survival, so they observe changes in the brain and behavior tied to olfaction.
The first observation was a functional one in the male mice themselves. After the odor and shock pairing, they saw that the mice grew more cells in their nose that specifically expressed the almond receptor. The brain was sending a clear signal. Almond is a critical danger signal in this environment. We need more sensory cells devoted to detecting it.
So that's rapid, localized biological adaptation. They actually observed the creation of new olfactory sensory neurons in the nose that specifically responded to the almond smell.
But here is the generational component that changes everything. Marlin then bred these male mice with unconditioned females.
And the offspring.
The offspring of the parents who underwent the shock conditioning were born with more cells that expressed the almond receptor, just like their conditioned fathers.
So they inherited this heightened biological sensitivity to that specific odor, even though they had never encountered the shock themselves.
They were born wired to overreact to almond, and the mechanism was tracked back to the sperm. This suggests a memory or an imprint of that environmental trauma. This critical survival information was somehow maintained in the sperm through implantation and was then represented physically in the neurological structure of the offspring.
It's essentially observing a form of rapid biological adaptation or evolutionary change over the time span of just one generation.
That is absolutely astonishing. It scientifically justifies what society has long known intuitively. Trauma changes people, and those changes, the way their biology and their brain are wired to react to the world, can be passed down to their children and grandchildren, influencing their behavior and risk responses before they ever make a conscious decision.
So who we are, therefore, is not just a product of our own deliberate choices, but a complex tapestry woven from our immediate social networks, our culture, our genetics, our development, and the profound, often traumatic experiences of the generations that came before us.
This is the ultimate context of the brain, and it makes that idea of unified, self-directed control even more tenuous.
So if the self is fragmented, agency is fragile, and we're constantly being influenced by our social life and our ancestors' trauma. What can we control?
A very good question.
We land on the great paradox of mastery. In some situations, the very thing we identified as the chief agent, the conscious, self-monitoring, decision-making prefrontal cortex, actually gets in the way of optimal performance.
That's right. The PFC, the seat of deliberate choice and self-awareness, is a powerful tool for planning and learning new things, but it is not optimized for every task. When we become highly skilled or need to access deep creativity, that constant monitoring system becomes a psychological and neurological detriment.
This is where neuroscientist Charles Lim's work on improvisation comes in. He studied freestyle rappers like Chris Emdin while they were performing inside an MRI scanner.
A very cool experiment.
The comparison was simple and stark. Performing memorized lyrics, which is a rehearsed skill, versus creating new, original lyrics spontaneously on the spot freestyle improvisation.
When Emden was rapping memorized lyrics, the brain activity was exactly as you'd expect. Regions tied to memory retrieval, speech production, and performance planning were active. But during intense, spontaneous improvisation, true freestyling, they found something entirely counterintuitive concerning the brain's filtering system.
The prefrontal cortex, the very region linked to impulse control, self-censorship, effortful monitoring, and deliberate decision-making, seemed to be dramatically turning off or deactivating.
Specifically, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the part that is highly active when you're self-correcting or deciding exactly what to say next. It just went quiet.
The implication for creativity is massive. For highly trained individuals to achieve peak spontaneous creativity or performance, they must bypass the conscious filter and the error detection system.
By letting go of that effortful self-monitoring, by decreasing activation in the decision-maker region, they actually gain control in a counterintuitive way, allowing the deeply ingrained subconscious skill pathways to take over and flow unimpeded.
It's the neurological equivalent of simply trusting the process. You have to be able to relax and let go of the need to control every word or every note.
The same way the motor cortex could run complex behaviors during sleepwalking, the motor and language centers here run the show without the PFC judging or censoring the output.
And if you try to put conscious control mechanisms over a skill you've already mastered, if you try to manually re-engage that PFC monitoring, your performance inevitably goes down.
You choke. This relates directly to the famous choking phenomenon we see in sports.
Exactly. Take a professional free throw shooter in basketball.
Oh.
They can sink 99% of their shots in practice. The motion is completely grooved into their procedural memory.
It's automatic.
But if you tell them $1 million is riding on the next shot, they are suddenly highly likely to choke and miss the shot they've made 1,000 times.
That pressure injects the conscious control mechanism, the PFC, into a skill that should have been left entirely to its deeply trained subconscious pathway. The decision maker tries to overthink the biomechanics, forcing awareness onto an automatic system, and it inevitably trips up the flow.
Charles Lim notes that life is fundamentally unscripted. We are constantly doing things that require spontaneous, unplanned action, like rapid social responses or creative problem solving.
Right.
But for mastered skills or spontaneous creation, the paradox remains. The decision maker, your prefrontal cortex, can sabotage you by forcing self-awareness onto a system that works best when it's operating on autopilot.
And ultimately, the ability to consciously choose when to deactivate the conscious self, to stop over-controlling, is a key step toward true mastery in life and in high-level skills. It's an act of agency to surrender agency.
We've covered a lot of ground today, diving into sources that have revealed the fragmented, delicate inner workings of our most complex organ.
We saw how the perception of a unified self splits under circumstances like sleepwalking and split brain surgery, demonstrating that the I is not a unitary thing, but a collection of distinct, powerful entities working in parallel.
We established that our sense of agency is incredibly fragile, easily manipulated by misdirection or subtle magnetic interventions, proving that the feeling of control is often retrospective, a narrative the brain creates after the action has been successfully taken to maintain a coherent sense of reality.
And critically, we explored the context. Who you are is constantly molded not just by your immediate social circle, but by ancestral trauma transmitted through epigenetic changes, showing that the influence on your wiring extends far beyond your own life experience.
The brain is a complicated collection of intricate, powerful parts, many of which you have no conscious awareness of, working together in a delicate dance to create the perception of you.
That feeling of unity might be an illusion constructed for efficiency. But your particular pattern of neuronal connections, the specific way those systems interact and synchronize, that actually creates your unique consciousness.
The vast majority of the brain's essential work is happening outside conscious awareness, running the clockwork, filtering the data through the thalamus, and guiding emotional responses via the insula and the prefrontal thermostat.
You cannot control everything that makes you who you are, but the unconscious you is still inherently and complexly you.
So here's the final provocative thought we leave you with. If we understand that the prefrontal cortex, the overthinking, self-monitoring, decision-making part, can actually decrease performance when injected into mastered skills, then perhaps the greatest and truest form of control we can achieve is choosing when to let go. You can't stop the external and internal forces that push you around, but you can choose when to stop trying to consciously over-control the things that should simply flow.
By becoming more aware of the sheer power and sophistication of the unconscious processes that drive you, the ones that already know how to paint the triangle or sink the free throw, you become more aware of what you truly are, a highly multifaceted, multidimensional person. And that strategic ability to surrender control is the key to achieving a higher, more effortless form of mastery.
Until next time, keep digging.